The evening had begun with nothing but calm. The kind of calm that felt earned after a brutal day of work. The sun was setting low, coating the lake in shades of orange and gold so bright it could have been painted onto the water. Grant Reed stood at the very edge of the dock his father had built back in the 1980s. The dock that had been his sanctuary since boyhood. Rod in hand, mind clear, he breathed in the crisp scent of aging wood and calm water. The kind of scent that quiets racing thoughts better than any therapy session could. For him, the lake wasn't just property. It was memory, inheritance, and home. That's when the footsteps came. At first, Grant thought he was imagining it. Heavy boots, 3 sets, thudding in rhythm on the wooden planks behind him. He turned and froze. Striding down his dock with the poise of TV cops were 3 men dressed in black uniforms. Their demeanor screamed official business, but something about them was off. Wrong patches, mismatched belts, the kind of theatrical confidence people only summon when they're bluffing. The leader was tall, at least 6'2", chin sharp, voice calm but falsely polite. "Excuse me, sir," he said, as if Grant were the intruder standing on their dock. "I'm Derek Hall, head of lake security. We're here on official business regarding violations of community waterway regulations." Grant blinked, trying to parse the words. Lake security? Regulations? On a dock that quite literally sat on his private lake? Derek gestured toward the fishing rod in Grant's hands as though it were incriminating evidence. "You need to cease all fishing activities immediately and surrender your equipment for inspection." Before disbelief even settled into anger, Grant spotted her. Lydia Hart, the HOA chairwoman herself, park bench perfect in a crisp white blouse and dark slacks, standing smugly at the edge of his property line. Arms folded, lips curled in the tight half-smile she wore when she thought she'd won something. 3 years in her chair position had taught every neighbor how Lydia operated. Regulations as weapons, bureaucracy as a cage. Even at 50 feet away, Grant could feel her presence pushing down on the lake like a shadow. Grant steadied his voice. "I'm sorry, but who exactly are you?" His words were calm even as his pulse quickened. He nodded toward the bold sign nailed to the post at the start of his dock. Private lake. No trespassing. "This is private property, gentlemen. I don't recall requesting security services. And as far as I know, there are no community waterway regulations here." "This isn't a community waterway." Derek's expression didn't flicker. He slipped a badge from his breast pocket with a flourish like a magician unveiling a card trick. But Grant had spent years spotting subtle scams in wildlife work, and this one didn't pass the sniff test. The badge was laughable. Cheap plastic, a cartoonish fish logo, bold words declaring Lake Patrol in a font that might have been plucked from a cereal box. Below it read Secure Guard LLC in tiny print, a child's prop, not an officer's authority. "We have full authority to enforce water safety and community standards," Derek intoned, posture rigid. Behind him, the shorter, stockier man, later known as Mason Pike, stepped forward and placed a hand on Grant's fishing rod. "Not confiscating, just touching, poking, establishing territory." "We're going to need that equipment," Mason growled, low and gravelly, as though hoping sheer intimidation would be enough. In that moment, angling turned to battle. Grant's peaceful dock had turned into a stage for a confrontation teetering between absurd comedy and creeping menace. He pulled his phone from his pocket and hit record, capturing the circus act unfolding before him. The cheap badge, the posturing, the fact that 3 costumed men were trespassing on clearly marked private property. "You're telling me," Grant said slowly, each word precise, cutting through the night air, "that you can confiscate my personal property while trespassing on my land? Is that what you want recorded here?" From the corner of his eye, he saw Lydia approach, clipboard in hand, heels clicking against the dock planks like the metronome of smug authority. "Grant, we've discussed this," she said, voice laced with forced patience. "Your fishing habits disrupt the aesthetic harmony of our community. The residents have filed complaints. The mess, the noise, the impression it gives to potential buyers, it can't continue." Grant stifled a laugh. He gestured around. The shoreline pristine. His dock maintained with care. No litter, no chaos, only still water reflecting the sunset. "What disruption?" A man, his rod, his piece. Mason stepped closer, the reek of cigarettes clinging to him. His jacket shifted, revealing a suspicious bulge at the hip, meant for Grant to notice. His gravelly voice cut deeper now. "Look, buddy, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. But you're done fishing today." Grant refused to step back. A flicker of memory shot through him. His father standing on this same dock handing him a rod as a boy. Fishing had never been just leisure. It was legacy. Derek raised the toy badge again, speaking like a judge delivering sentence. By the authority vested in Secure Guard LLC by the Homeowners Association, we confiscate. But Grant wasn't hearing him anymore. His instincts told him this was no ordinary HOA scuffle. Something reeked of more than power trips. He zoomed in with his phone camera on the fine print at the edge of Derek's badge. There it was, plain as day, made in China. And at that moment he knew. Whatever was happening on his lake tonight was bigger, bolder, and far more dangerous than a trio of bad actors in fake uniforms. The line had been cast, but not just into the water. This was bait for a fight he hadn't chosen, but one he was about to uncover to its depths. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time Grant shut his eyes, he saw Derek's plastic badge flashing in the golden light of sunset, and Mason's hand curling possessively around the fishing rod. Threats had a way of echoing louder in silence, and the silence of his house was suffocating. Around 2 a.m, he gave up entirely on rest and turned to what he knew best: investigation. Years working in wildlife conservation had trained him well. The darkest truths often revealed themselves not during the day's noise, but in the quiet stretches when men thought no one was watching. And if these imposters wanted to scare him off his dock, then there had to be something worth hiding beneath the surface of his lake. From the garage, Grant pulled out the tools of his trade, his camera kit, a decent but trusty drone fitted with high-resolution optics and infrared capability, and a notebook thick with conservation field notes. By 3 o'clock, the night sky had thinned into ink, stars scattered overhead, the air so still it felt like even the lake was holding its breath. The water's surface mirrored a sliver of moonlight smooth as glass, whispering for discretion. Grant set up his drone, palms tightening against the remote controls as the rotors whirred softly to life, the sound faint against the cricket chorus of the shoreline. He launched the device skyward, and instantly his perspective changed. From above, his lake looked like polished obsidian cradled by the darker ring of forest. But to the trained eye, inconsistencies could be hunted down: pipes, shadows, scars of activity not meant to be there. It was sound, not sight, that led him first. A faint grinding noise carried by the still air, mechanical and irregular, like a pump choking on its own burden. He followed it along his shoreline, staying low behind trees until he reached the landscaped border where community property began. That's when he saw it, hidden beneath shrubs expertly planted to obscure the view. A massive intake pipe thrust directly into the lake, sucking water with greedy strength. His drone's camera captured the brutal sight: tiny fish, weeds, algae, and even strands of fragile spawning nests pulled relentlessly into the system. Generations of ecological life his family had protected for decades were being chewed away in secret. Freshly poured concrete anchored the system, the ground still raw around its edges as if the installation had been done mere weeks earlier. This wasn't old negligence. This was new, deliberate sabotage. The realization hit Grant like cold water. His suspicion about Derek's theatrics, Lydia's clipboard authority, Mason's menace, all of it pointed to a bigger conspiracy. They weren't there because of his rod or his catch-and-release rituals. They were there because he had gotten too close, too visible, to something destructive they desperately wanted concealed. As Grant crouched in the shadows, his drone hovering silently above, twin beams of light sliced across the grass. Flashlights sweeping methodically, Grant's heart clamored against his ribs as he pressed himself flat into the dirt, the metallic taste of adrenaline coating his tongue. Derek's voice carried low across the night. "Keep the levels steady until he stops fishing. We don't need him catching on." Mason's gravelly reply rattled even through whisper. "If he keeps poking around, we'll make him stop. Permanently." Grant clenched his fists until his nails bit into their palms. That had been no casual threat. It was intent, veiled but real. For a moment, fear urged him to retreat, to pack up his gear, to pretend ignorance. But then his camera shutter clicked almost involuntarily, preserving frame after frame. The pump, the pipes, Derek's flashlight, Mason's looming figure. Evidence mattered more than fear, and with that thought he forced himself still in the dirt until their voices faded into the night. Only then did he crawl back toward the tree line, lungs burning with his restraint. Just before leaving, something caught the moonlight beside the pump house, glinting canisters half hidden beneath a warped tarp. Through his telephoto lens, labels grew clear enough to chill him to the marrow. These weren't pool cleaners or simple fertilizers. They bore hazard symbols too severe, warning triangles screaming of toxicity. Industrial-grade chemicals, formulations designed for clearing algae from artificial ponds or suppressing growth in controlled waterways but banned from natural ecosystems altogether. If introduced to his lake, they could poison fish, suffocate plant life, and ultimately contaminate surrounding lands. This wasn't negligence anymore. It was premeditated ecocide. Grant returned to his dock long before dawn, shaking but fortified with grim purpose. By then, he had documented everything: angles of piping, construction quality, chemical identifiers, each piece capable of standing in court. But evidence alone rarely won wars against fraud and intimidation. Fraud excused itself easily as misunderstanding until backed into a corner. As he sat at his father's weathered dock, dawn breaking fresh across the water, he remembered a set of biological dye markers left over from his last field project, harmless to fish, fluorescent under certain light. A tool for studying migration patterns that, if used cleverly, could track where the lake's stolen life was flowing. And so, for hours that morning, Grant worked like a craftsman, carefully catching small bass and bluegill with nets, applying tiny spots of harmless dye, and releasing them back into the dark mirror of his lake. Each marked fish was no longer just part of the ecosystem, it was living testimony. If Derek's concealed pumps were feeding the irrigation system or being dumped elsewhere, Grant would know. He'd follow their trail like glowing breadcrumbs in the water. By the time the sun crested higher, his hands smelled of scales and his drums beat with exhaustion, but his determination had twisted into steel. That morning, he was no longer a man simply fishing on his childhood dock. He was the lone guardian of a lake under siege and the only witness prepared to reveal a scheme so audacious, it destroyed not just property rights, but the fragile balance of nature itself. What Derek, Mason, and Lydia had tried to disguise with intimidation and clipboards, Grant was unraveling in silence with evidence, and war was only beginning. By the time the sun had burned its way into the sky that following week, Grant's evidence folder was already swelling. Photos, videos, water samples, drone footage, all cataloged with the precision of a field scientist and the urgency of a man preparing for war. But raw evidence wasn't enough. He knew from experience that corruption never toppled simply because truth existed. It toppled once the truth spread like a wildfire no one could ignore. And in his neighborhood, that fire meant exposing not just Derek's cheap badge or Mason's intimidation, but the entire network Lydia Hart had spun under the polished title of Homeowners Association Governance. The first crack came not from technology but from paper. The most innocent-looking document often hides the deadliest lie. Late one evening, Grant scoured the state's public business registry websites, where corporations live and die in official records. A few keystrokes revealed what he already suspected. SecureGuard LLC, the supposed security firm Derek had boasted about, had been dissolved 6 months earlier for failing to pay renewal fees. On paper, it was a ghost company. In reality, it was the front used to terrorize his dock and shake down residents. Every order Derek barked, every time he waved that toy badge, it had all been delivered under the name of a business that didn't legally exist. Fraud in its purest, boldest form. That night, a bitter anger coursed through him. He pictured Derek practicing his speeches into the bathroom mirror, polishing his authority like a prop, all while cashing checks signed with Lydia's elegant pen strokes. It was fraud, but not the sloppy variety. This was a theater of legitimacy, with Lydia as director, Derek and Mason cast as enforcers, and the entire neighborhood as an unwilling audience. The question was how much money had vanished during the performance. Grant wanted confirmation, so he brought the evidence to Carol, the no-nonsense neighbor with an accountant's eye for detail and a heart hardened by too many bogus HOA fines. At her kitchen table, among lace placemats and gently steaming tea, he spread out printouts of the dissolution records and a series of HOA financial statements he'd combed through. Carol adjusted her glasses, eyes narrowing as she traced the columns of figures. For 5 full minutes, only the scratch of her calculator keys filled the silence. Then she slammed her palm against the table so sharply that her teacup rattled on its saucer. "This isn't incompetence," she snapped, her usually controlled voice quivering with a mixture of rage and betrayal. "This is organized theft. Lydia has been funneling our dues into a pretend company and we've all been paying for it. Literally paying for it. Like fools. Her voice cracked, not out of weakness, but the pain of realization. I thought it was just me. Every notice I got, I thought maybe I'd messed up some landscaping rule or mailbox height standard. But it wasn't me, was it? It was them. Always them. With Carol's permission, Grant recorded her testimony, capturing not just her words but the raw emotion hiding in her trembling hands. It was evidence with more gravity than paperwork, the weight of human exploitation documented in shaky tones. From that moment, the fraud had a face. But Grant kept digging, and what he found was worse than either of them could have imagined. Secure Guard was merely the tip of the iceberg. A deeper dive revealed a carousel of phantom vendors, companies with names like Evergreen Maintenance Services and Harmony Legal Advisors. Their invoices appeared consistently across HOA statements, always rounded off conveniently, always signed by Lydia herself, but when Grant tracked them, they led to empty mailboxes, disconnected numbers, or strip mall addresses that had never hosted a legitimate business. Each name was another mask Lydia had crafted, chipped with the same brush, fake contractors siphoning money month after month, all with her signature approving the path. By the time Grant returned home that evening, his dining room looked less like a peaceful house and more like a detective's war room. Papers covered the table, tracing arrows between Lydia's forged signatures, Derek's dissolved company, and bank transactions that crisscrossed like veins carrying poisoned blood. Every detail built a larger picture. Lydia wasn't just manipulating HOA rules. She had constructed an underground empire of shell companies and phony contracts, bleeding thousands of dollars from residents under the cover of community management. The intimidation campaigns made sense now. The fake fines dropped in mailboxes, the violation notices mailed to anyone Lydia saw as a threat, the elaborate posturing by Derek and Mason in their dime store uniforms. None of it was about order or aesthetics. All of it was about leverage, moving pawns around the board to guard Lydia's position as queen. The lake, however, was the linchpin, because while fake fines could anger neighbors, environmental crime could end legacies. And if Grant's investigation proved she was feeding toxins into the lake system, her castle of lies would crumble in court before it even burned in community outrage. As the evidence stretched in front of him, Grant's thoughts shifted from personal defense to something larger. It was no longer about a man protecting his dock. It wasn't even about a neighborhood stuck under Lydia's iron smile. This had grown into systematic fraud, environmental destruction, organized intimidation, and the certainty that none of it would stop unless everyone saw it with their own eyes. Voices alone died in whispers, but a community armed with undeniable proof, that would roar. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at him, eyes lingering on an old photo of his father smiling with base strung across his catchline on the very dock where this had all begun. "They think I'm just a man with a fishing rod," he murmured into the quiet. "They don't know I've spent my life catching predators, recording patterns, and exposing what hides beneath. And they've got no idea what's coming once the neighborhood sees the truth." The investigation was no longer his burden alone. It was about to become theirs. The neighbors who paid the dues, the families who'd been lied to, and every homeowner Lydia had cornered with her fake letters and cardboard justice. And for the first time since Derek's heavy boots had rattled his dock, Grant smiled, not in relief but in anticipation. The empire Lydia built out of forged signatures and plastic badges was about to be seen in broad daylight, and daylight is the one thing fraud can never survive. The HOA's monthly meeting had always been more ritual than event. Neighbors would trickle into the folding chair-lined community hall, sigh through landscaping updates and budget pie charts, and then shuffle out again with barely a word. But this time the air was charged. Word of strange fines, Derek's heavy-handed antics, and whispers of something off in the HOA's books had started spreading like storm clouds. By 6:45 p.m., people were packed into the hall, murmuring curiously, a restless undercurrent quivering beneath the otherwise polite silence. Grant sat near the front, folder brimming with evidence, laptop humming with slides, heart steady but coiled tight like a spring. He hadn't come to argue tonight. He'd come to expose. Lydia opened as expected. Flawless posture at the podium, hair immaculate, smile taut. "Good evening, everyone." Tonight's meeting will be focused on preserving harmony in our community and maintaining the high standards that protect our property values. She clicked to her first slide, a glossy aerial shot of the lake. A red arrow jabbed down toward Grant's dock like a scarlet accusation. One resident, she continued with manufactured gravity, has repeatedly disrupted these standards, engaging in activities that undermine both aesthetic harmony and community safety. A soft wave of whispers rippled through the crowd, eyes shifting uncomfortably toward Grant. But Grant didn't flinch. He waited until she clicked to her second slide, an obviously doctored image exaggerating disturbances around his dock, before rising calmly to his feet. "Excuse me, Lydia," he said, steady voice cutting through her carefully designed cadence. "Before you continue, I'd like to clarify something important. This meeting isn't about standards. It's about authority. And authority, unlike PowerPoint slides, is rooted in law, not personal preference." He lifted a chart from his folder, moving to the front. One column read HOA rules with bullet points like landscaping and parking violations. The other column read federal and state law, listing environmental protections, private property rights, fraud statutes. He held the chart high so rows of curious eyes could follow. Your HOA can regulate hedges and paint colors, but it cannot rewrite deeds recorded with the county or establish phantom security forces to trespass on private property. This entire lake, he held up his property deed now, letting neighbors pass it hand to hand, is mine. And that's not just an opinion. It's law. The hall buzzed louder now. People craned their necks, murmuring over the official paperwork. Then Carol stood, small but firm, a paper in hand. "Lydia, can you explain this?" She held up what looked like a county printout. "Because according to the clerk's office, Secure Guard LLC, the so-called company we've been paying for security, was dissolved 6 months ago. Yet HOA records show funds still going to them every month. Who exactly is cashing those checks?" The wave of murmurs became a collective gasp. Lydia's smile faltered for the first time. She shuffled her clipboard nervously. "That's an administrative misunderstanding," she began, but her voice no longer carried conviction. At that moment, the hall doors creaked open and in strode Derek, Mason, and 2 other men in their black uniforms, posturing as if stepping onto a movie set. They crossed their arms at the back of the room, glaring with the pride of enforcers who thought their mere presence was enough to restore order. But tonight was different. Tonight the neighbors weren't intimidated. Phones rose into the air, recording every second. Derek's voice carried soon after, theatrically rehearsed. "I'm Derek Hull, head of Lake Security for Secure Guard LLC. The HOA has contracted us to enforce regulations on community waterways. This man," he stabbed a finger toward Grant, "has continuously defied those standards." But before Grant could even reply, Carol's voice cut sharp across the silence. "Mr. Hall, perhaps you'd like to explain why your company has been receiving HOA funds despite being officially non-existent. 6 months dissolved, isn't that right?" She waved the county record printout. Gasps turned into pointed stares. Derek faltered, jaw tightening before anger overtook composure. He tried to march toward the projector, intending to block Grant's slides, but before he reached the front, another voice sliced across the room like a scalpel. "Sit down." "Mr. Hall." The woman's tone was calm but carried the weight of steel. Paige Walker stood there in her wildlife enforcement uniform, badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. Unlike Derek's toy trinket, hers bore the gravitas of the state government. She stepped forward, cool as winter water. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Officer Walker with State Wildlife Enforcement. I was asked to attend tonight as a neutral third party to clarify matters of law and environmental authority." The room shifted instantly. Neighbors who moments ago felt uncertain now clung to this sudden anchor of legitimacy. Paige opened a folder with deliberate grace. "I've reviewed the situation. Mr. Reed's deed establishes private ownership of the lake, confirmed at state and county levels. Furthermore, unauthorized interference, including trespass, fraudulent impersonation of officers, and environmental damage constitute criminal offenses under state law." She turned, eyes narrowing directly on Derek's toy badge. Waving cheap plastic in people's faces and calling it authority is not only deceptive but criminal impersonation, and that carries penalties. The hall went quiet except for phone cameras clicking. Lydia tried to interject, voice a brittle ribbon. "Officer Walker, with respect, this meeting is about community standards, not legal interpretations." No, Page replied evenly. It's about law. Standards don't bury intake pumps under the lake. Standards don't forge financial invoices to dissolved companies. Criminal intent does. The reaction was electric. Neighbors weren't whispering anymore. They were voicing outrage aloud, disgust breaking the fog of intimidation they'd carried for years. Bob, the environmental consultant father from the fishing day, raised his voice. I checked Grant's evidence myself. The intake system is destroying fish spawning grounds. And those chemicals they're dumping? They're lethal. This isn't about harmony. It's about criminal cover-ups. Phones captured every raised voice, every paper waved, every official statement from Page. Derek and Mason shuffled like actors suddenly stripped of lines mid-performance. Their frowns no longer theatrical but desperate. Lydia clutched her clipboard like it could shield her, eyes darting as she scrambled to maintain control. But it was finished. Tonight, intimidation crumbled beneath truth in plain sight. And as Page spoke firmly about charges, responsibilities, and real consequences, Grant realized the balance had shifted. For the first time, the HOA wasn't towering invisible authority anymore. It was just Lydia in designer shoes, Derek with his toy badge, Mason reeking of cigarettes, and 30 neighbors who would never be fooled again. The arrests themselves felt almost surreal. For months, Derek's theatrical swagger, Mason's looming threats, and Lydia's smug smile had hovered around the community like unshakable shadows. Yet at that lakeside pavilion, under the glare of fluorescent lights and 100 phone cameras, their performance unraveled. Page Walker read their rights with a steady calm, and for the first time, the lake security villain stood visibly small, plastic badges dangling useless, their air of authority collapsing in real handcuffs. The neighborhood, once cowed into uneasy silence, burst into a wave of murmurs, some relieved, others angry, but all finally unafraid. For Lydia, Derek, and Mason, the masquerade was over, but arrest was only the spark. In the following weeks, the fire spread. The federal prosecution moved quickly, weaving together the threads Grant and his neighbors had collected. The evidence was almost absurd in its completeness. Fraudulent bank transactions laid bare, invoices signed by Lydia herself, video proof of Derek's trespassing intimidation, photos of intake pumps and hazardous canisters, and even the glowing dive fish swimming like tiny living witnesses. Every document, every photo, every voice recording layered into a case so strong, the defense lawyers could only cling to formality. Environmental crimes, conspiracy, fraud, criminal impersonation. The charges stacked higher than Lydia's clipboard ever could. Derek faced counts of operating a fraudulent business, theft under false authority, and his side hustle as a walking uniform impersonator. Mason, his shadow and enforcer, was charged with intimidation and aiding the fraud scheme. Both men offered cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing, confessing how the entire operation had been orchestrated under Lydia's watchful direction. But it was Lydia, polished, calculating Lydia, who bore the heaviest weight. Conspiracy, forgery, environmental violations, systematic misappropriation of HOA funds. Her empire of shell companies was not a clever game anymore. It was a criminal network bared to daylight. The HOA's insurance company conducted an internal audit and their report hit like a thunderclap. Lydia's schemes had siphoned over $60,000 directly from residents' dues. Every fake fine, every ghost vendor, every dollar trickled through her careful handwriting into her own pockets or into Derek's play-acting militia. Once public, the outrage turned volcanic. Neighbors who once whispered complaints now stormed meetings with demands for reform. Local journalists picked up the case, broadcasting headlines about an HOA scandal turned environmental crime ring, a suburban stage play collapsing into farce. People around the county suddenly recognized the story as their own greatest fear, an HOA not as protector but predator. Meanwhile, cleanup began with the same steady focus as prosecution. Under court order, the illegal intake pumps were ripped from the lake, concrete slabs smashed and removed. Environmental engineers filtered the contaminated water with specialized systems. State biologists surveyed spawning grounds, reseeding plant life, restoring habitats, and monitoring health. Slowly, the lake exhaled. The grinding pumps went silent, replaced once more by the ripple of fish darting where they belonged. The water regained clarity, sunlight no longer dimmed by pollutants. Where once Grant crouched, trembling in shadows, drones recording evidence in secret, now children stood with nets in hand. laughing as tiny minnows slipped through their fingers. New leadership rose almost naturally from the ashes. Bob, the environmental consultant father who had been captivated during the kids' fishing day, was elected interim HOA chairman. Carol stepped forward too, the accountant's sharp eye ensuring no invoice or budget would ever again escape scrutiny. Margaret and the Williams family, once victims of Lydia's intimidation letters, joined the board to amplify the voices of ordinary residents. Together, the group rewrote policy, weaving in transparency, audits, and protections. Where Lydia twisted the word standards as a weapon, the new board used it as shield, truly protecting the community, rather than preying upon it. Grant's position was less official, but perhaps more powerful. His investigation became the blueprint for others. How one resident, armed with stubborn resolve and facts, could dismantle corruption. State regulators took notes on his methods. Bob even incorporated parts of Grant's biological dye study into training modules on ecosystem monitoring. Conservation journals praised his meticulous evidence gathering, and other communities began looking at their own HOAs with sharpened eyes. Grant knew he hadn't just fought for his dock. He'd fought for anyone who had ever felt small against manufactured authority. 6 months later, standing once more at the edge of his dock, Grant watched the sun slide into the calm water, the reflection soft and unbroken, as if the lake itself had healed. Ducks drifted lazily. Bass flickered near the surface. Carol joined him with steaming mugs of coffee, setting one on the chair carved decades ago by his father. "It feels different now," she said with a small smile. "Like the lake finally belongs to us instead of her." Grant nodded, eyes scanning the peaceful scene, Bob teaching his kids to fish, Margaret's grandchildren collecting stones along the shore, laughter replacing the bitter meetings of the past. The victories were not only in law or money returned, but in proof. Proof that bullies could be toppled when ordinary neighbors stopped standing alone. Proof that authority only carried weight when rooted in truth. Proof that even in the smallest places, suburban lakeshores and folding chair meeting rooms, justice could surge like a tide. His father's old saying came back to him, "Water keeps better records than people." The lake had indeed kept them. Every poisoned gallon, every destroyed nest, every chemical stain. But it had kept something else too, resilience. Now justice flowed with it. As the sun set, Grant smiled, not from relief but from quiet triumph. He cast his fishing line gently into the water, not as habit but as promise. This dock, this lake, this legacy, they had tried to steal it with fake authority and brittle intimidation. Now it stood restored, stronger than before, guarded not by plastic badges but by truth. The empire of lies had collapsed, and what remained was community, clarity, and the calm certainty that light always exposes shadows.